Well met, and welcome to Toad Tales. Today, we will be reading Upheaval, Turning Points for Nations in Crisis by Jared Diamond. To get you all acquainted with the book, I'm going to read the little Johnny John that's on the inside. And yeah, here we go. Diamond compares how 6 countries have survived recent upheavals, ranging from the forced opening of Japan by U.S. Commodore Perry's fleet to the Soviet Union's attack on Finland, to a murderous coup or counter-coup in Chile and Indonesia, to the transformations of Germany and Australia after World War II. Because Diamond has lived and spoken the language in 5 of these 6 countries, he can present gut-wrenching histories experienced firsthand. These nations coped, to varying degrees, through mechanisms such as acknowledgement of responsibility, painfully honest self-appraisal, and learning from models of other nations. Looking to the future, Diamond examines whether the United States, Japan, and the whole world are successfully coping with the grave crises they currently face. Can we learn from lessons of the past? That gives you a good little intro to the gist of this book. Today we're just going to be reading the prologue, and we're just going to get into it, feel the waters, see if it's fire, see if it's hitting, you know how it is, and let's get into it. Prologue, Legacies of Coconut Grove. This prologue is divided into 5 parts. First part being 2 stories, second part being what's a crisis, thirds, individual and national crises, fourth, what this book is and isn't, and fifth and finally, the plan of the book. This should get us pretty well acquainted with what's going on, and let's get into this. One take, baby. One take. Prologue, Legacies of Coconut Grove. 2 stories. At one or more times during our lives, most of us undergo a personal upheaval or crisis, which may or may not get resolved successfully through our making of personal changes. Similarly, nations undergo national crises, which also may or may not get resolved successfully through national changes. There is a large body of research and anecdotal information, built up by therapists, about the resolution of personal crises. Could the resulting conclusions help us to understand the resolution of national crises? To illustrate personal national crises, I'll begin this book with 2 stories from my own life. It's said that a child's earliest datable firm memories are laid down from around the age of 4 years, although children are also retain indistinct memories of earlier events. That generalization does apply to me, because the earliest memory that I can date is of Boston's Coconut Grove fire, which happened just after my 5th birthday. Although, fortunately, I was not at the fire myself, I experienced it secondhand through the frightening accounts of my physician father. On November 28, 1942, a fire broke out and spread rapidly through an overcrowded Boston nightclub called Coconut Grove, the owner's spelling. Okay, so what you see on the screen, how I have the little coconut spelled incorrectly, okay, that's what it's written as. So, don't hate the player, hate the literature. Whose sole exit became blocked. A total of 492 people died, and hundreds of others were injured, by suffocation, smoke inhalation, or being trampled or burned. Boston physicians and hospitals were overwhelmed, not just by the wounded and dying victims of the fire itself, but also by the fire's psychological victims. Relatives, distraught that their husbands or wives or children or siblings had died in a horrible way, and the fire survivors, traumatized by guilt because they had survived while hundreds of other guests had died. Until 10:05 p.m., their lives had been normal and focused on celebrating the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, a football game, and wartime leaves of soldiers. By 11 p.m., most of the victims were already dead, and the lives of their relatives and of the survivors were in crisis. Their expected life trajectories had been derailed. They felt ashamed that they were alive while a dear one was dead. The relatives had lost someone central to their identity. Not only for the fire survivors, but also for Bostonians remote from the fire, including me as a 5-year-old, the fire shook our faith in a world of justice. Those punished weren't naughty boys and evil people. They were ordinary people, killed through no fault of their own. Some of those survivors and relatives remained traumatized for the rest of their lives. A few committed suicide, but most of them, after an intensely painful several weeks during which they could not accept their loss, began a slow process of grieving, reappraising their values, rebuilding their lives, and discovering that not everything in their world was ruined. Many who had lost spouses went on to remarry. Even in the best cases, though, decades later they remained mosaics of their new identities formed after the Coconut Grove fire, and of their old identities established before the fire. We shall have frequent opportunity throughout this book to apply the metaphor of mosaic to individuals and nations in whom or in which desperate elements coexist uneasily. Coconut Grove provides an extreme example of a personal crisis, but it was extreme only in that bad things befell a large number of victims simultaneously. In fact, so many victims that the fire also provoked a crisis demanding new solutions in the field of psychotherapy itself, as we'll see in Chapter 1. Many of us experienced individual tragedy firsthand in our lives, or secondhand through the experience of a relative or a friend. Yet such tragedies that strike only one victim are as painful to that victim and to his or her circle of friends as Coconut Grove was to the circle of its 492 victims. Now, for comparison, here's an example of a national crisis. I lived in Britain in the late 1950s and early 1960s, at a time when it was undergoing a slow national crisis. Although neither my British friends nor I fully appreciated it then, Britain was world-leading in science, blessed with a rich cultural history, proudly and uniquely British, and still basking in memories of having the world's largest fleet, the greatest wealth, and the most far-flung empire in history. Unfortunately, by the 1950s, Britain was bleeding economically, losing its empire and its power, conflicted about its role in Europe, and struggling with long-standing class differences and recent waves of immigrants. Things came to a head between 1956 and 1961, when Britain scrapped all of its remaining battleships, experienced its first race riots, had to begin granting independence to its African colonies, and saw the Suez Crisis expose the humiliating loss of its ability to act independently as a world power. My British friends struggled to make sense of those events and to explain them to me as an American visitor. Those blows intensified discussions among the British people and British politicians about Britain's identity and role. Today, 60 years later, Britain is a mosaic of its new self and its old self. Britain has shed its empire, become a multi-ethnic society, and adopted a welfare state and high-quality government-run schools to reduce class differences. Britain never regained its naval and economic dominance over the world, and it remains notoriously conflicted, Brexit, about its role in Europe. But Britain is still among the world's 6 richest nations, is still a parliamentary democracy under a figurehead monarch, is still a world leader in science and technology, and still maintains as its currency the pound sterling rather than the euro. Those two stories illustrate this book's theme. Crises and pressures for change confront individuals and their groups at all levels, ranging from single people to teams to businesses to nations to the whole world. Crises may arise from external pressures, such as a person being deserted or widowed by his or her spouse, or a nation being threatened or attacked by another nation. Alternatively, crises may arise from internal pressures, such as a person becoming sick or a nation enduring civil strife. Successful coping with either external or internal pressures requires selective change. That's as true of nations as of individuals. The key word here is selective. It's neither possible nor desirable for individuals or nations to change completely and to discard everything of their former identities. The challenge, for nations as for individuals in crisis, is to figure out which parts of their identities are already functioning well and don't need changing, and which parts are no longer working and do need changing. Individuals or nations under pressure must take honest stock of their abilities and values. They must decide what of themselves still works, remains appropriate even under the new and changed circumstances, and thus can be retained. Conversely, they need the courage to recognize what must be changed in order to deal with the new situation. That requires the individuals or nations to find new solutions compatible with their abilities and with the rest of their being. At the same time, they have to draw a line and stress the elements so fundamental to their identities that they refuse to change them. Those are among the parallels between individuals and nations with respect to crises. But there are also glaring differences that we shall acknowledge. Part 2. What's a crisis? How do we define a crisis? A convenient starting point is the derivation of the English word crisis from the Greek noun crisis. It's K instead of a C, so maybe that's crisis. Also, I know I fucking am not saying derivation correctly. And the verb krino, which have several related meanings: to separate, to decide, to draw a distinction, and turning point. Hence, one can think of a crisis as a moment of truth, a turning point when conditions before and after that moment are much more different from the one another than before and after most other moments. I put the words moment, much more, and most in quotes because it's a practical problem to decide how brief should be the moment, how different should be the changed conditions, and how much rarer than most other moments should a turning point be for us to label it as a crisis, rather than just as another small event blip or a gradual natural evolution of changes. The turning point represents a challenge. It creates pressure to devise new coping methods when former coping methods have proved inadequate to resolve the challenge. If an individual or a nation does devise new and better coping methods, then we say that the crisis has been resolved successfully. But we'll see in Chapter 1 that the difference between success and failure in resolving a crisis is not often sharp. That success may just be partial, may not last forever, and the same problem may return. Think of the United Kingdom resolving its world role by entering the European Union in 1973, and then voting in 2017 to leave the European Union. That was in parentheses. By the way, that's not my own personal interjection. But anyhow, let's now illustrate that practical problem. How brief, how major, and how infrequent must a turning point be to warrant applying the term crisis? How often in an individual's lifetime, or in a millennium of regional history, is it useful to label what happens as a crisis? Those questions have alternative answers. Different answers prove useful for different purposes. One extreme answer restricts the term crisis to long intervals and rare dramatic upheavals, just a few times in a lifetime for an individual, and just every few centuries for a nation. As one example, a historian of ancient Rome might apply the word crisis to only 3 events after the foundation of the Roman Republic around 509 BC. The first, 2 wars against Carthage, 264 to 241 and 218 to 201 BC, the replacement of republican government by the empire around 23 BC, and the barbarian invasions leading to the Western Roman Empire's fall around AD 476. Of course, such a Roman history doesn't consider everything else in Rome's history between 509 BC and AD 476 as trivial. He just reserves the term crisis for those 3 exceptional events. At the opposite extreme, my UCLA colleague David Rigby and his associate Pierre-Alexandre Balland and Ron Bushma published a fine study of technological crises in American cities, which they define operationally as periods of sustained downturn in patent applications, with the word sustained defined mathematically. According to those definitions, they found that an American city undergoes a technological crisis on average about every 12 years, and that the average such crisis lasts for 4 years, and that an average American city finds itself in a state of technological crisis for about 3 in every decade. They found that definition to be fruitful for understanding a question of much practical interest. What enables some but not other American cities to avoid technological crises defined in that way? But a Roman historian would dismiss the events studied by David and his colleagues as ephemeral bagatelles, while David and his colleagues would counter that the Roman historian is neglecting everything that happened in 985 years of Roman history except for 3 events. My point is that one can define crisis in different ways, according to different frequencies, different durations, and different scales of impact. One can usefully study either rare big crises or frequent small crises. In this book, the time scale that I adopt ranges from a few decades to a century. All of the countries that I discuss have experienced what I consider as a major crisis during my lifetime. That isn't to deny that all of them also experience more frequent, smaller turning points. Both for individual crises and for national crises, we often focus on a single moment of truth. For instance, the day when a wife tells her husband that she is filing for divorce, or, for Chilean history, the date September 11, 1973, when the Chilean military overthrew Chile's democratic government, whose president committed suicide. A few crises do indeed arrive out of the blue with no antecedents, such as the December 26, 2004 Sumatra tsunami that suddenly killed 200,000 people, or my cousin's death in the prime of his life when his car was crushed by a train at a railroad crossing, leaving his wife widowed and his 4 children orphaned. But most individual as well as national crises are the culmination of evolutionary changes extending over many years. For example, the divorcing couple's prolonged marital difficulties, or Chile's political and economic difficulties. The crisis is a sudden realization of, or a sudden acting on, pressures that have been building up for a long time. This truth was acknowledged explicitly by Australia's Prime Minister Go Whitlam, who, as we'll see in Chapter 7, devised a whirlwind program of apparently major changes in 19 days of December 1972, but who downplayed his own reforms as recognition of what had already happened. Part 3. Individual and national crises. Nations aren't individuals writ large. They differ from individuals in many obvious ways. Why is it nevertheless illuminating to view national crises through the lens of individual crises? What are the advantages of this approach? One advantage, which I often encounter in discussing national crises with friends and students, is that individual crises are more familiar and understandable to non-historians. Hence the perspective of individual crises making it easier for lay readers to relate to national crises and to make sense of their complexities. Another advantage is that studying of individual crises has yielded a roadmap of a dozen factors that help us to understand the varying outcomes. Those factors provide a useful starting point for devising a corresponding map of factors to understand and vary. Oh, fuck, I messed that one up. Those factors provide a useful starting point for devising a corresponding map of factors to understand the varying outcomes of national crises. We shall see that some factors translate straightforwardly from individual crises to national crises. For instance, individuals in crisis often receive help from friends, just as nations in crisis may recruit help from allied nations. Individuals in crisis may model their solutions on ways in which they see other individuals addressing similar crises. Nations in crisis may also borrow and adapt solutions already devised by other nations facing similar problems. Individuals in crisis may derive self-confidence from having survived previous crises. So do nations. Those are among the straightforward parallels. But we'll also see that some factors illuminating outcomes of individual crises, while not straightforwardly transferable to national crises, still serve as useful metaphors suggesting factors relevant to national crises. For instance, therapists have found it helpful to define a quality of individuals termed ego strength. While nations don't have a psychological ego strength, that concept suggests a related concept important for nations, namely national identity. Similarly, individuals often find their freedom of choice in resolving a crisis limited by practical constraints, such as childcare responsibilities and job demands. Of course, nations aren't limited by childcare responsibility and job demands. But we'll see that nations do experience limitations on their freedom of choice for other reasons, such as geopolitical constraints and national wealth. Comparison with individual crises may also brings into sharper relief those features of national crises lacking analogs for individual crises. Among those distinctive features, nations have leaders but individuals don't. So questions about the role of leadership arise regularly for national crises but not for personal crises. Among historians, there has been a long and still ongoing debate about whether unusual leaders really changed the course of history, often termed the great man view of history, or whether history's outcome would have been similar under any other likely leader. For instance, would World War II have broken out if a car accident had came close to killing Hitler in 1930 actually had killed him? Nations have their own political and economic institutions. Individuals don't. Resolution of national crises always involves group interactions and decision-making within the nation, but individuals can often make decisions by themselves. National crises may be resolved either by violent revolution, Chile in 1973, or by peaceful evolution, Australia after World War II, but lone individuals don't commit violent revolutions. Those similarities, metaphors, and differences are why I have found comparisons of national crises and individual crises useful in helping my UCLA students to understand national crises. Part 4. What this book is and isn't. Readers and reviewers of a book often gradually discover, as they read, that the book's coverage and approach aren't what they expected or wanted. What are this book's coverage and approach, and which coverages and approaches do I not include? This book is a comparative, narrative, exploratory study of crisis and selective change operating over many decades in 7 modern nations, all of which I have much personal experience and viewed from the perspective of selective change and personal crises. Those nations are Finland, Japan, Chile, Indonesia, Germany, Australia, and the United States. Let's consider, one by one, each of these words and phrases. This is a comparative book. It doesn't devote its pages to discussing just one nation. Instead, it divides those pages among 7 nations, so that those nations can be compared. Non-fiction authors have to choose between presenting single case studies and comparing multiple cases. Each approach has different advantages and different limitations. In a given length of text, single case studies can of course provide far more detail about that single case, but comparative studies can offer perspectives and detect issues that wouldn't emerge from studying just a single case. Historical comparisons force one to ask questions that are unlikely to emerge from a case study. Why did a certain type of event produce result R, R1, in one country, and when it produced a very different result, R2, in another country? For example, one-volume Histories of the American Civil War, which I love reading, can devote 6 pages to the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, but can't explore why the American Civil War, unlike the Spanish and Finnish Civil Wars, ended with the victors sparing the lives of the defeated. Authors of single case studies often decry comparative studies as oversimplified and superficial, while authors of comparative studies equally often decry single case studies as unable to address broad questions. The latter view is expressed in the quip, "Those who study just one country end up understanding no country." This book is a comparative study with its resulting advantages and limitations. Because this book divides its pages among 7 nations, I'm painfully aware that my account of each nation has to be concise. As I sit at my desk and turn my head, I see behind me, on my study's floor, a dozen piles of books and papers, each up to 5 feet high, one pile for the material of each chapter. It was agonizing for me to contemplate condensing 5 vertical feet of material on post-war Germany into one chapter of 11,000 words. So much had to be omitted, but consciousness has its compensations. It helps readers to compare major issues between post-war Germany and other nations, without becoming distracted and overwhelmed by fascinating details, exceptions, ifs, and buts. For readers who want to go on to learn more fascinating details, the concluding bibliography of this book lists books and articles devoted to single case studies. This book style presentation is narrative. That is, the traditional style of historians, going all the way back to the foundation of history as a discipline developed by the Greeks and authors Herodotus and Thucydides, over 2,400 years ago. Narrative style means that arguments are developed by prose reasoning, without equations, tables of numbers, graphs, or statistical tests of significance, and with only a small number of cases studied. That style may be contrasted with a powerful new quantitative approach in modern social science research, making heavy use of equations, explicit testable hypotheses, tables of data, graphs, and large sample sizes, i.e. many cases studied, that permit statistical tests of significance. I've learned to appreciate the power of modern quantitative methods. I used them in a statistical study of deforestation on 73 Polynesian islands, in order to reach conclusions that could never have been extracted convincingly from a narrative account of deforestation on a few islands. I also co-edited a book in which some of my co-authors ingeniously used quantitative methods to resolve questions previously debated endlessly and without resolution by narrative historians. For example, whether Napoleon's military conquests and political upheavals were good or bad for the subsequent economic development of Europe. I'd initially hoped to incorporate modern quantitative methods into this book. I devoted months to that effort, only to reach the conclusion that it would have to remain a task for a separate future project. That's because this book instead had to accomplish the task of identifying, by a narrative study, hypotheses and variables for a subsequent quantitative study to test. My sample of just 7 nations is too small for extracting statistically significant conclusions. It will take much further work to operationalize my narrative's qualitative concepts such as successful crisis resolution and honest self-appraisal, i.e., to translate those verbal concepts into things that can be measured by numbers. Therefore, this book is a narrative exploration, which I hope will stimulate quantitative testing. Among the world's more than 210 nations, this book discusses only 7 familiar to me. I made repeated visits to all 7. I've lived for extended periods, beginning as long as 70 years ago, in 6 of them. I speak or formerly spoke the languages of those 6. I like and admire all of those nations, happily revisit all of them, have visited all within the last 2 years, and seriously considered moving permanently to 2 of them. As a result, I can write sympathetically and knowledgeably about them, on the basis of my own first-hand experiences and those of my long-term friends living long periods of time for us to have witnessed major changes. Among my 7 nations, Japan is one of which my first-hand experience is more limited, because I don't speak the language and have made only briefer visits extending back in time for only 21 years. In compensation, though, for Japan I have been able to draw on the lifelong experiences of my Japanese relatives by marriage and of my Japanese friends and students. Of course, the 7 nations that I selected on the basis of those personal experiences aren't a random sample of the world's nations. 5 are rich, industrialized nations, 1 is modestly affluent, and 1 is a poor developing nation. None is African, 2 are European, 2 are Asian, and 1 each is North American, South American, or Australian. It remains for other authors to test to what extent my conclusions derived from this non-random sample of nations apply to other nations. I accepted that limitation and chose those 7 because of what seemed to me the overwhelming advantage of only discussing nations that I understand on the basis of long and intense personal experience, friendships, and, in 6 cases, familiarity with the language. This book is almost entirely about modern national crises that occurred within my lifetime, permitting me to write from the perspective of my own contemporary experience. The outlier which I discuss changes before my lifetime, again involves Japan, to which I devote 2 chapters. One of those chapters discusses Japan today, but the other discusses Japan of the Meiji era, 1868 to 1912. I included that chapter on Meiji Japan because it constitutes such a striking example of conscious and selective change, because it is still in the recent past, and because the memories and issues of Meiji Japan remain prominent in modern Japan. Of course, national crises and change have also occurred in the past, and pose similar questions. Though I can't address questions of the past from personal experience, such past crises have been the subject of a large literature. Well-known examples include the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Christian era, the rise and fall of Southern Africa's Zulu state in the 19th century, the 1789 French Revolution and subsequent reorganization of France, and Prussia's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Jena in 1806, its conquest by Napoleon, and its subsequent social, administrative, and military reforms. Several years after I began to write this book, I discovered that a book whose title refers to similar themes, crisis, choice, and change, had already been published by my own American publisher in 1973. That book differs from mine, including several case studies from the past, as well as in other basic respects. It was a multi-authored edited volume using a framework called system functionalism. Research by professional historians emphasizes archival studies, i.e., the analysis of preserved written primary documents. Each new history book justifies itself by exploiting previously unutilized or underutilized archival sources, or by reinterpreting archival sources already utilized by other historians. Unlike most of the numerous books cited in my bibliography, my book is not based on archival studies. Instead, its contribution depends on a new framework derived from personal crises, an explicitly comparative approach, and a perspective drawn from my own life experience and those of my friends. Part 5. Plan of the book. This is not a magazine article about current affairs, intended to be read for a few weeks after its publication, and then to fall out of date. Instead, this is a book expected to remain in print for many decades. I state that obvious fact just to explain why you might otherwise be astonished to find nothing whatsoever in this book about the specific policies of the current Trump administration in the U.S., nor about President Trump's leadership, nor about the current Brexit negotiations in Britain. Anything that I could write today about those fast-moving issues would become embarrassingly superseded by the time that this book is published, and would be useless a few decades from now. Readers interested in President Trump, his policies, and Brexit will find abundant published discussions elsewhere. But my Chapter 9 and 10 do have a lot to say about the major U.S. issues that have been operating for the past 2 decades, that are now claiming even more attention under the current administration, and that are likely to continue to operate for at least the next decade. Now, here's a roadmap to my book itself. In my first chapter, I shall discuss personal crises, before devoting the rest of this book to national crises. We've all seen, by living through our own crises and witnessing the crises of our relatives and friends, that there is much variation among crisis outcomes. In the best cases, people, this page is really poorly printed, succeed in figuring out new and better coping methods, and they emerge stronger. In the saddest cases, they become overwhelmed and revert to their old ways, or else they adopt new but worse coping methods. Some people in crisis even commit suicide. Therapists have identified many factors, of which I'll discuss a dozen in Chapter 1, influencing the likelihood that a personal crisis will be successfully resolved. Those are the factors for which I'll explore parallel factors influencing the outcomes of national crises. To anyone who groans in dismay, a dozen factors are a lot to remember. Why don't you reduce them to just a few? I reply, it would be absurd to think that the outcomes of people's lives, or of nations' histories, could be usefully reduced to just a few catchwords. If you should have the misfortune to pick up a book claiming to achieve that, throw it away without reading any further. Conversely, if you have the misfortune to pick up a book proposing to discuss all 76 factors influencing crisis resolution, throw that book away also. It's the job of a book's author, not of a book's reader, to digest and prioritize life's infinite complexity into a useful framework. I found that using a dozen factors offers an acceptable compromise between those two extremes. Detailed enough to explain much of reality, without being so detailed as to constitute a laundry list useful for tracking laundry, but not for understanding the world. That introductory chapter is followed by 3 pairs of chapters, each pair on a different kind of national crisis. The first pair concerns crises in 2 countries, Finland and Japan, that explored a sudden upheaval provoked by shocks from another country. The second pair is also about crises that exploded suddenly, but due to internal explosions, in Chile and Indonesia. The last pair describes crises that did not explode with a bang, but that instead unfolded gradually, in Germany and Australia, especially due to stresses unleashed by World War II. Finland's crisis, Chapter 2, exploded with the Soviet Union's massive attack upon Finland on November 30, 1939. In the resulting Winter War, Finland was virtually abandoned by all of its potential allies and sustained heavy losses, but nevertheless succeeded in preserving its independence against the Soviet Union, whose population outnumbered Finland by 40-1. I spent a summer in Finland 20 years ago, hosted by veterans and widows and orphans of the Winter War. The war's legacy was conspicuous selective change that made Finland an unprecedented mosaic, a mixture of contrasting elements. An affluent, small, liberal democracy pursuing a foreign policy of doing everything possible to earn the trust of the impoverished, giant, reactionary Soviet dictatorship. That policy was considered shameful and denounced as Finlandization. Somebody tell me how to say that right. Finlandization, that's how I'm going to call it. By many non-Finns who failed to understand the historical reasons for its adoption. One of the most intense moments of my summer in Finland unfolded when I ignorantly expressed similar views to a Winter War veteran, who replied by politely explaining to me the bitter lessons that Finns had learned from being denied help by other nations. The other of the two crises provoked by an external shock involved Japan, whose long-held policy of isolation from the outside world was ended on July 8, 1853, when a fleet of American warships sailed into Tokyo Bay's entrance, demanding a treaty and rights for U.S. ships and sailors, Chapter 3. The eventual result was the overthrow of Japan's previous system of government, a consciously adopted program of drastic, wide-ranging change, and an equally conscious program of retention of many traditional features that leave Japan today as the world's most distinctive, rich, industrialized nation. Japan's transformation during the decades following the U.S. fleet's arrival, the so-called Meiji era, strikingly illustrate at the national level many of the factors influencing personal crises. The decision-making processes and resulting military successes Meiji Japan Meiji Japan help us by contrast to understand why Japan made different decisions in the 1930s, leading to its crushing military defeat in World War II. Chapter 4 concerns Chile, the first of the pair of countries whose crises were internal explosions resulting from a breakdown of political compromise among their citizens. On September 11th, 1973, after years of political stalemate, Chile's democratically elected government under President Allende was overturned by a military coup whose leader, General Pinochet, remained in power for almost 17 years. Neither the coup itself nor the world records for sadistic torture smashed by Pinochet's government had been foreseen by my Chilean friends while I was living in Chile several years before the coup. In fact, they had proudly explained to me that Chile's long democratic traditions, so unlike those of other South American countries. Today, Chile is once again a democratic outlier in South America, but selectively changed, incorporating parts of Allende's and parts of Pinochet's models. To U.S. friends who commend my book manuscript, this Chilean chapter was the most frightening chapter of my book, because of the speed and completeness with which a democracy turned into a sadistic dictatorship. Paired with that chapter in Chile is Chapter 5 on Indonesia, whose breakdown of political compromise among its citizens also resulted in the internal explosion of a coup attempt. In this case, on October 1st, 1965, the coup's outcome was opposite to that of Chile's coup. A counter-coup led to genocidal elimination of the faction presumed to have supported the coup attempt. Indonesia stands in further contrast to all the other nations discussed in this book. It is the poorest, least industrialized, and least westernized of my 7 nations, and it has the youngest national identity, cemented only during the 40 years that I have been working there. The next 2 chapters, chapters 6 and 7, discuss German and Australian national crises that seemingly unfolded gradually instead of exploding with a bang. Some readers may hesitate to apply the term crisis or upheaval to such gradual developments. But even if one prefers to apply a different term to them, I have still found it useful to view them with the same framework that I used to discuss more abrupt transitions, because they pose the same questions of selective change and illustrate the same factors influencing outcomes. In addition, the difference between explosive crises and gradual change is arbitrary rather than sharp, and they grade into each other. Even in the cases of apparently abrupt transitions, such as Chile's coup, decades of gradually growing tension led to the coup, and decades of gradual changes followed it. I describe the crises of Chapter 6 and 7 as only seemingly unfolding gradually, because in fact, post-war Germany's crisis began with the most traumatic devastation experienced by any of the countries discussed in this book. Germany's ruined condition as of the date of its surrender in World War II on May 8, 1945. Similarly, while post-war Australia's crisis unfolded gradually, it began with 3 shocking military defeats within the space of less than 3 months. The first of my 2 nations illustrating non-explosive crises in post-World War II Germany, Chapter 6, which was simultaneously confronted with the issue of its Nazi-era legacies, of disagreements about its society's hierarchical organization, and of the trauma of political division between West and East Germany. Within my comparative framework, distinctive features of crisis resolution in post-war Germany include exceptionally violent clashes between generations, strong geopolitical constraints, and the process of reconciliations with nations that have been victims of German wartime atrocities. My other examples of non-explosive crises in Australia, Chapter 7, which has remodeled its national identity during the 55 years that I have been visiting. When I first arrived in 1964, Australia seemed like a remote British outpost in the Pacific Ocean. still looking to Britain for its identity, and still practicing a white Australia policy that limited or excluded non-European immigrants. But Australia was facing an identity crisis, because that white and British identity conflicted increasingly with Australia's geographic location, foreign policy needs, defense strategy, economy, and population makeup. Today, Australia's trade and politics are oriented towards Asia. Australian city streets and university campuses are crowded with Asians, and Australian voters only narrowly defeated a referendum to remove the Queen of England as Australia's head of state. However, as in Meiji Japan and Finland, those changes have been selective. Australia is still a parliamentary democracy, its national language is still English, and a large majority of Australians are still British by ancestry. All of these national crises discussed so far are well recognized and have been resolved, or at least resolutions are long underway, with the result that we can evaluate their outcomes. The last 4 chapters describe present and future crises, whose outcomes are still unknown. I begin this section with Japan, Chapter 8, already the subject of Chapter 3. Japan today faces numerous fundamental problems, some of which are widely recognized and acknowledged by the Japanese people and government, while others are not recognized or even are widely denied by the Japanese. At present, these problems are not clearly moving toward solution. Japan's future is truly up for grabs, in the hands of its own people. Will the memories of how Meiji Japan courageously and successfully overcame its crisis help modern Japan to succeed? The next 2 chapters, chapters 9 and 10, concern my own country, the United States. I identify 4 growing crises that hold the potential to undermine American democracy and American strength within the next decade, as already happened in Chile. Of course, these are not discoveries of mine. There is open discussion of all 4 among Americans, and a sense of crisis is widespread in the U.S. today. It appears to me that all 4 problems are not currently moving toward solution, but are instead getting worse. Yet, the U.S., like Meiji Japan, has its own memories of overcoming crisis, notably our long and lacerating Civil War, and our suddenly being dragged out of political isolation into World War II. Will those memories now help my country to succeed? Finally comes the whole world, Chapter 11. While one could assemble an infinite list of problems facing the world, I focus on 4 for which it seems to me the trends already underway will, if they continue, undermine living standards worldwide within the next several decades. Unlike Japan and the U.S., both of which have long histories of a national identity, self-government, and memories of successful collective action, the whole world lacks such a history. Without such memories to inspire us, will the world succeed? How that, for the first time in history, we are confronted with problems that are potentially fatal worldwide? This book concludes with an epilogue that examines our studies of 7 nations and of the world. In the light of our dozen factors, I ask whether nations require crises to galvanize them into undertaking big changes. It required the shock of the Coconut Grove fire to transform short-term psychotherapy. Can nations decide to transform themselves without the shock of a Coconut Grove? I consider whether leaders have divisive strategies on history. I propose directions for future studies, and I suggest types of lessons that might realistically be gained from examining history. If people, or even just their leaders, choose to reflect on past crises, then understanding of the past might help us to resolve our present and future crises. That is the end of the prologue. Well, what an interesting little intro to our journey that we are about to embark upon. It seems that our boy here is trying to tell us that we could possibly solve our future issues based on how we deal with individual crises on our own, as well, of course, as the evidence from history, and if the world is going to succeed or fail. I'm very, very excited to continue to read, and I'm very, very excited to share my reading with all of you. Thank you again for watching the video. Shout out to Brady, who helped inspire me to make the video, and I'll see you on the next page of Toad Tales.